Well, let's go to Queensland because this time each week we hear from the former Premier of Queensland, Campbell Newman, not just about Queensland things, national and international. But before we do, last week on the Alan Jones Facebook page, I posted some comments about this unelected Dr. Jeannette Young, Queensland's Chief Health Officer. My comments reached 253,000 people and attracted 2,000 comments. This was after my attention was brought to this Dr. Young's supercilious comments, and I quote, "I've already seen great examples of where people have managed it. They've swapped their lives. So at the moment, they live on one side and work on the other, and a friend does the opposite," unquote. I made the point that there are many people unemployed and sent bankrupt by Jeannette Young, thinking she's the Premier, and being allowed by the Labor government in Queensland to behave as if she's the Premier, and not a voice in the Liberal opposition prepared to tell the Queensland voter that it's unacceptable. The name of Jeannette Young doesn't appear on the ballot paper, and she wants to be able to swap their lives. Well, I repeat what I said. There were plenty of Queenslanders whom she's put out of work or sent bankrupt or have faced family turmoil, dare I say suicide. They'd swap with Jeannette Young, who's not surrendered a cent while barking out ignorant and uninformed instructions to innocent Queenslanders. Well, Jeannette Young, they're a wake up to you. As I said, I posted my comments on Facebook. They were seen by over 250,000 people and over 2,000 comments, many of them unrepeatable. Campbell Newman, the former Queensland Premier, joins me. Campbell, thank you for your time. Well, this lady was given an op-ed piece in yesterday's Sunday Mail. A public servant.
Look, it was extraordinary, Alan, to wake up on Sunday morning and see an open letter from the Chief Health Officer to Queenslanders. And I've got my notes here because I want to get this right. Here's some of the pearls that were in this open letter. Quote, "The bad news is it's unlikely we'll return to life as we know it." Then she admits that the modelling was worse than what actually happened. Our modelling at the time painted a dire picture. Then later on she talks about this is far from over. This is only the beginning of the pandemic. Now, Alan, if this is the individual giving advice to the Premier of Queensland, and if you've got time and want to permit me, I will go through some of the complete mistakes or stuff-ups that we've seen from Palaszczuk and Jeannette Young over the last few months. Well, let's start with a very topical one, which shows the cruelty and callousness of this bureaucracy and the way these people are power mad. There is a mum who had a baby in Lismore, just over the New South Wales border in recent days. The baby had to be taken to Brisbane for urgent medical treatment after the birth, and the mum and the father couldn't get into Queensland, can't get into Queensland unless they do 14 days in quarantine. And look, we saw a story about the Prime Minister recently reaching out because he heard of a child who was suffering due to border issues down, I think, interstate in Victoria.
There's no proof, though, that anything happened, Campbell. There's no proof that anything happened.
Well, yes. Well, Prime Minister, this is where you do need to show some leadership. But let's just go on. I mean, that is callous and outrageous. We've had no community transmission for 28 days, and yet everybody who wants to go to a venue, a restaurant, is giving their names, addresses, phone numbers, like they're living in a police state. I go back historically, they waved through a funeral in Mackay, but they banned flyovers on Anzac Day. They waved through a Black Lives Matter protest in Brisbane. They approved a security contractor coming back from overseas, from Afghanistan, who had COVID-19, to travel on a commercial airline flight into the Sunshine Coast and then travel to Toowoomba. There are inconsistent rules. If they're so darn ready for a pandemic, why, when we saw the breakout in Logan, were there queues that went round the block, people queuing for 5, 6, 7 hours? That doesn't smack of preparedness, Alan.
No.
That smacks of a total lack of resourcing and planning.
But see, at the moment, Campbell, I'm just looking at these lists here. At the moment, there are 11 people in hospital, apart from Victoria, 11 people across Australia in hospital and 7 in intensive care. And we're crushing and smashing the economy and denying people their freedoms. It is beyond me. You wonder how much longer the public are going to put up with this.
Well, Alan, I would say to these politicians, and I'm talking about everyone, and don't get me wrong, I'm not pointing at Labor or coalition politicians. This is across the board. the politicians from the Prime Minister downwards need to understand this. They may be getting, high marks in the polls at the moment, but when the crushing reality of an economic depression, the unemployment lines, the smashed businesses and ripped apart livelihoods and the families that have been destroyed, when that reality hits home, they will wear it. And
Absolutely.
The big thing everyone, Alan, needs in this country, and I know you've been talking about this, we need a plan. Yeah. We don't need these ongoing sort of just hunker in and pull the doona over our heads of restrictions. We need a plan. I mean, we're hearing now about Sweden and Switzerland that actually have a degree of freedom that we would just love to have at the moment. They've protected the elderly, they've protected the vulnerable, and they've got on with life, and their economic impact has not been as Australia.
But Campbell, I mentioned to Michael, and everyone's talking about it, we're not the only ones talking about it, what about this ban on anyone leaving the country until October 24? I mean, this is unbelievable.
Well, this is
no other democracy in the world.
This is
North Korea stuff.
Well, that's when, again, exactly, that's when you do have to cry police state. And this is at the feet of Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton. How dare they stop us going out of our own country?
Yes.
How dare they? You can tell, Alan, I'm pretty angry about this. But then, the flip side, I don't know if your viewers know this, Alan, but right around the world, there are Australian families who want to come home. And you know what? When they try and come home and they book an airline flight, they're told by the airline, yes, Mr. Smith, you can have your family and, 3 loved ones come with you. But as you get close to the date, they say, sorry, no seats available. But you could fly business class. So what do we see from this government? The ACCC sicked onto the airlines. But the dirty, dirty truth of this, Alan, is the reason that the airlines are doing this is, for example, in Brisbane, I'm told you can only bring 70 people in a day. That's because our federal government and the state authorities will not get off their butts and actually plan and deliver as a government should. Why a restriction on 70?
I know.
But meanwhile, Alan, we then read in the newspapers that they're prepared, and this is Birmingham, the Education Minister, another coalition minister, is prepared to wave through hundreds of overseas students to go to university.
But Campbell,
ahead of Australians.
I know. But Campbell,
when is our government going to actually open the borders, plan properly, get these public servants who've suffered not any hurt, suffered no job losses, suffered no job loss to their incomes, get them off their butts to plan and deliver and work for us during this pandemic so that at least we can keep the wheels turning over.
Good on you. Just before you go, I mean, everywhere you see this totalitarian behaviour, what about Clive Palmer and WA? Here we've got a situation where in 2002, Clive Palmer was given approval to mine in the Pilbara. Keep it pretty simple, 2002. Subsequently, a Liberal government under Colin Barnett said, no, that approval is not going to be given. So Clive Palmer said, we'll go through the appropriate tribunals and courts. He won every case in every court to such an extent that they then said, well, we'll go now to a final hearing in November for compensation. Clive Palmer said, I'll be after $30 billion. So the government says, right, we'll pass a law to say there can be no compensation, there can be no appeal, there can be no access to freedom of information, there can be no documents released about any of it. This is the law. So if it's Clive Palmer today, it could be anyone tomorrow, and Scott Morrison and the national government are silent.
Well, again, Alan, and look, people who've followed myself and Clive Palmer and our run-ins over the years were about to faint with astonishment, but I'm behind Clive on this one, as I am, by the way, with his constitutional challenge to get the borders open.
Yes.
How about that, Alan? And, this is a great wrong, and worse, it's being supported by the Liberal Party in WA. What do you stand for as a Liberal Party? Are you prepared to allow the rights under the law of any individual to be ripped up in this way? The fact that the Barnett government got this wrong and created this huge vulnerability of the state of WA, well, that's the problem for the WA government and the parties over there. But at the end of the day, if I could put it in a way that people may understand, if you remember the movie The Castle, this is like in that show, the government says, no, we're going to legislate to take away those good folk in their home. Take their home away without any compensation, remove all their rights. So, frankly, WA is going to have to suck this up. Their government stuffed it up, and the WA government and now the WA Liberal Party need to explain to the community why they got it so wrong. And it's a sad day when a Conservative opposition would actually support this odious legislation.
The Conservative opposition supported the Labor government, and it has been passed. It's been passed by the Parliament. So basically, no compensation can be paid to Clive Palmer no matter what happens, and there is no right to appeal, and no individual can mount a challenge against the West Australian government. Full stop.
And just because, and I guess they're just counting on the fact that perhaps Clive isn't so popular these days, and so who cares if his property rights are stripped away. But anyone who's doubting this evening, going, oh, yeah, why are they defending Clive? Well, it's like this. It could happen to you.
Absolutely. And
the law is meant to be blind to people's circumstances, their wealth, their economic circumstances.
You're in good form tonight,
Alan,
Mr. Newman.
This is a travesty.
You're in good form tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Jones. You get the best out of me.
Get the best out of you. We'll see you next week, Campbell. Wonderful stuff. There he is, Campbell Newman. He's spot on. And spot on. Can you imagine a mother was unable to travel to Brisbane with the baby. The baby's being treated on the other side of the border. The mum and the dad can't see the baby in Queensland unless they go into quarantine for 14 days. Anastasia, for God's sake, show a bit of humanity and compassion and common sense.